The grim discovery on a quiet suburban night. On a serene April evening in 1993, the peaceful suburban outskirts of Mason, Ohio, lay under the soft glow of a pale crescent moon. The occasional flicker of porch lights from distant houses painted faint patterns down the isolated neighborhood streets. An unsettling calm stretched across the empty roads, interrupted only by the gentle breeze rustling through trees and the faint hum of traffic from the main highway miles away. It was nearing midnight when Jessica and Mark Peterson, a local couple in their late 30s, were driving home after an evening visit to Mark's sister. The couple had taken a shortcut through Willow Creek Lane, an all-too-quiet, narrow, unpaved road flanked by dense woods and wild, overgrown fields. The lane was infamous for its eerie stillness, its surrounding vast darkness seemingly untouched by modern suburban developments. Jessica leaned back in the passenger seat, her mind preoccupied with mundane thoughts about the leftovers she packed from dinner and a lingering argument with her sister-in-law. As they reached a slight curve, Mark instinctively slowed the car. Suddenly their focus snapped to the roadside as a peculiar shape came into view under the dim beams of their car's headlights. "What the hell is that?" Jessica squinted, sitting upright. Mark turned to his wife but said nothing, quietly easing the car to a halt. The headlights illuminated what clearly wasn't just another discarded tire or pile of trash. Jessica gasped. There in the grass, unmoving, was what appeared to be a person, a woman, her body sprawled in an unnatural position near the ditch. "Jesus," Mark whispered, his voice trembling, "stay in the car. Call 911. Jessica reached for her cell phone as Mark cautiously stepped out. The crunch of his shoes on the gravel road echoed like thunder in the still of the night. With a flashlight in hand, taken from the glove compartment, he approached the figure. The beam of light revealed the horrifying truth. A young woman no older than her mid-20s lay lifeless on the ground. Her pale skin was marred with bruises, her clothes torn and disheveled. Mark staggered back, the bile rising in his throat. She's not alive, she's gone," he whispered, voice quivering as he called back to Jessica inside the car. "She's been attacked." Feeling a dread unlike anything she'd known, Jessica's fingers fumbled on her phone as she relayed their chilling discovery to the 911 operator. "Oh my God," she stuttered. There's a woman here. She's not moving. She looks hurt, or dead." Minutes felt like hours as they waited for the authorities. Mark stood several feet away from the body, too stunned and overwhelmed to do anything but stare in silent disbelief. Jessica locked the car doors, her racing pulse making her feel lightheaded. The familiar suburban safety they'd always taken for granted now felt remote and meaningless. When the responding officers arrived, crimson and blue lights bathed the small stretch of Willow Creek Lane. The quiet air turned heavy with the tension of a potential crime scene, breaking the fragile illusion of suburbia's security. The first officer on the scene, Deputy Rachel Hensley, crouched low by the body, her face tightening as she examined the surroundings. Another officer marked the perimeter with reflective tape while Jessica and Mark stood wrapped in the warmth of a police blanket, giving their shaken statements. The coroner arrived shortly after, confirming what everyone already feared. The woman had indeed been dead for several hours before her body was discovered. Early observations suggested she had been brutally assaulted before succumbing to strangulation, but what sent additional chills down the spines of even the most seasoned first responders was the horrifying expression frozen on her face, eyes wide open, staring at the starless heavens above, as if locked in a silent plea. Deputy Hensley remained by the body a bit longer than the others, her seasoned instincts picking up on the eerie familiarity of the scene. "This wasn't random," she murmured to herself. The meticulous arrangement of the victim's possessions just feet away, a purse left slightly unzipped, keys deliberately placed on the grass, made it clear. Whoever had done this wasn't sloppy. They had a plan. By the following morning, the scene would transform into a media frenzy. The victim was identified as Sarah Whitman, a 24-year-old local art student who had last been seen leaving her college library late the previous evening. Those who knew Willow Creek Lane whispered stories of the unlit road's unnerving silence, but none could have predicted that their idyllic suburb would become the focal point of something so grotesque. For the people of Mason, Ohio, the sense of safety they'd long celebrated was shattered like glass. This wasn't merely a crime, it was the prelude to something far darker, and it was only just beginning. The start of the investigation. The morning sun struggled through a haze of clouds as Mason, Ohio stirred awake to the news of the grisly discovery. The calm streets of suburbia were now humming with conversations, Whispers, theories, and an undercurrent of unease spreading like wildfire throughout the community. The residents of Mason were used to simple lives, a comforting monotony of backyard barbecues, kids playing on front lawns, and well-lit sidewalks. The ghastly murder of Sarah Whitman shattered that tranquil image, and yet, to the authorities, this was just the beginning, setting up the scene. "All right, let's contain this," said Detective Michael Graves, stepping out of his unmarked car and pulling his necktie loose. Graves was a seasoned investigator in his 40s, a man with sharp eyes that were ever watchful, but hid an undercurrent of exhaustion. He had seen crime scenes before, but something about this one gnawed at him in an uncomfortable way. Deputy Rachel Hensley greeted him near the makeshift perimeter marked with yellow crime scene tape. Her demeanor was professional, but her eyes betrayed a spark of quiet intensity. "We've sealed off the area as best we could," Rachel said, motioning toward the scrubby grass where several officers were hunched over evidence markers among the overgrowth. "There wasn't much traffic on the lane last night. It's pretty isolated out here." "Good," Graves muttered, surveying the scene. His gaze fell on the spot where Sarah's lifeless body had been found. The crime scene photos hadn't done justice to the eerie stillness of that patch of grass, as though it had become a graveyard long before her death. "What have we got?" "A tangle of clues." Rachel led him to the evidence collection area, where a small gathering of forensics officers meticulously categorized items recovered near Sarah's body. A partially opened purse lay atop a plastic evidence bag. Next to it sat a set of closely placed car keys, untouched save for the grass stains on the keychain. "The arrangement of her belongings," Rachel explained, gesturing, "is deliberate, almost ritualistic. Keys here, purse open, nothing stolen, nothing missing. It feels purposeful, like someone wanted us to look." Graves frowned, assessing the scene. "No obvious signs of a struggle?" Rachel shook her head. "That's the strange part. Signs of physical abuse on the victim, but there's no clear disturbance around her. No overturned grass, no scattered items outside this." She waved her hand, encircling the small radius of evidence. "It's like she was placed here after wherever it happened." As Rachel continued her report, the coroner stepped into the conversation. Dr. Margaret Lee, still pulling gloves off her wrinkled hands, gave a tired but thorough assessment. She was likely dead 6 to 8 hours before discovery. Bruises across the arms suggest restrained movement during her time with the suspect. Death appears consistent with strangulation. There are ligature markings on her neck. "Ligature," Graves echoed, rubbing his chin. "Cord? Rope?" Dr. Lee nodded. "We're still running tests, but I'd say something thin. Plastic cord or synthetic rope. This wasn't improvised. This killer came prepared. The town reacts." As word of Sarah Whitman's identity spread, Mason's residents reacted with shock and fear. The small-town grapevine hummed with speculation. Was it someone local? A drifter? Someone Sarah knew? At her college campus, students mourned. She had been a talented art major, always staying late in the library to perfect her sketches. No one could understand what had brought her to Willow Creek Lane that fateful night. "We'll need to canvass the entire college," Graves told Rachel as they stood over the investigation board later that afternoon at the station. The board had already begun to fill with Sarah's picture, a map of the area, and scribbled notes alongside photographs of the crime scene. Friends, faculty, anyone she saw that day. If she left the library, someone may have seen which direction she went. Rachel nodded. "We should also hit the surrounding neighborhoods, see if anyone heard anything. Though given how far out that lane is from most homes." "It's a shot in the dark," Graves interjected, finishing the thought. "But it's worth taking." He paused before pointing to the map, pinned at the center of the board. "And I want patrols stationed on Willow Creek Lane every night this week. Whoever did this may feel brazen enough to return." Early frustrations. For all their efforts, critical information remained scarce. Interviews with Sarah's friends painted a picture of a quiet, driven young woman who rarely courted trouble. Footage from nearby traffic cameras was virtually non-existent for such an isolated stretch of road. And search dogs brought to the woods surrounding Willow Creek Lane found little beyond faint chemical traces that suggested a cleaning agent may have been used to mask evidence on the ground. "What kind of killer cleans up after themselves out there?" Rachel asked as she and Graves stared at the lack of results coming in. "It's miles from anywhere. Why bother?" "Because it means something to them," Graves replied grimly. "This wasn't random. Someone planned this, every detail from the place to the cleanup to how they wanted her to look when we found her." He pointed again to Sarah's photograph on the board. "They're sending a message. We just don't know who the recipient is yet." An eerie lead emerges. It was nearly a week later when the investigation took its first tentative step forward. One of the forensic pathologists working on Sarah's case flagged an unusual detail: embedded fibers in the ligature wounds. They had initially overlooked them, but under stronger magnification, it became apparent that the fibers were synthetic, likely nylon. Graves frowned as he studied the forensic report on his desk that night. Nylon cord. That's specific. Maybe boating-related? Camping? Rachel, who had leaned in over his shoulder to read the report, gave a slow nod. Most people wouldn't have access to something like that unless it was for a hobby or a job. You think it narrows things down? It's not much, Graves said, his voice heavy. But it's something. If we can cross-reference purchases at local hardware stores. Back to the grind, Rachel muttered, already preparing for another late night. A killer's shadow. As investigators poured through Sarah Whitman's life and a growing pile of circumstantial evidence, a subtle shift was occurring in Mason. Neighbors locked their doors earlier, jogging routes were abandoned. A kind of paranoia took root in the hearts of the town's residents. Sarah Whitman's death had cracked open a dark underbelly to the sleepy suburb. An unspoken understanding that the killer wasn't some faceless out-of-town boogeyman. He or she was someone among them, moving through their streets unnoticed. Perhaps even enjoying the spectacle of their own crime reverberating through dinner conversations and local headlines. But no one, not even Graves or Rachel, could have anticipated what was coming next. The wave of panic spreads. By the days following Sarah Whitman's murder, Mason, Ohio was unrecognizable from the quiet, close-knit community it had been just weeks ago. Gone was the calm stroll of families in the evenings, the barking of dogs at friendly passers-by, and the occasional late-night joggers along sunlit suburban streets. In their place was an overwhelming air of suspicion, dread, and collective paranoia. By the third day, local newspaper headlines screamed, "Horror on Willow Creek Lane," flanked by blurred images of crime scene investigators combing the woods. Cable news channels carried the story further, speculating about whether a predator stalked the quaint suburbs of southern Ohio. More than 10,000 people in neighboring counties now knew the name Sarah Whitman, and the first tendrils of fear began to wrap tightly around Mason's identity. Locking doors and whispering fears. It started quietly. Hardware stores reported a spike in sales of deadbolts, padlocks, and floodlights. Gun shops across the county reported increased demand, especially for handguns in easy-to-carry sizes. Home security companies fielded so many inquiries that installation technicians were booked out for months. On Maple Street, a woman in her 50s scolded her husband when he forgot to lock their front door after an evening smoke. "We're not taking chances," she hissed, pulling down the blinds for emphasis. While Mason had never been crime-free, Sarah's murder struck a nerve like nothing before. This wasn't a petty burglary or even a random act of violence. This was something more calculated, more sinister. Teenagers who once rode their bikes freely until the streetlights came on, now found themselves grounded by worried mothers. Women who usually enjoyed solo evening walks now clung to pepper spray or stayed safely indoors. Even the friendly greetings exchanged between neighbors felt different, strained by shared nervous glances, as if each was silently questioning whether the other could be trusted. The birth of misinformation. Without any concrete leads from law enforcement, the rumor mill began its inevitable churn. At first, they whispered about Sarah herself. Was she seeing someone? Did someone from her past come back to haunt her? Perhaps it was an outsider, some drifter passing through Mason looking for trouble. But as the days stretched into a week with no arrests or updates, the suspicions widened to include anyone and everyone. "Haven't you noticed Ted's been acting weird?" one man at a local diner remarked to his wife, glancing warily toward their neighbor's property. "I've seen his lights on late at night lately." "Oh, stop it," his wife replied, though she couldn't quite keep the doubt out of her voice. Facebook and local community forums lit up with conspiracy theories. One post suggested Mason's high school janitor, who kept to himself and often worked the night shift, might know something. Another theorized that a white van seen parked in Willow Creek Lane's vicinity was involved, sparking a rash of residents reporting mysterious vans, even if they were simply delivering Amazon packages. And then came the divergent camps. Some blamed a transient population, calling for tighter restrictions on nearby shelters, while others feared it could be someone within Mason's well-manicured streets. What if it's someone we know? What if they're watching us right now? A community on edge. The Mason Police Department quickly became inundated with calls from alarmed residents. Someone reported muffled sounds coming from their neighbor's basement, Another claimed to have seen a suspicious figure standing under the shadows of a broken streetlight. Each lead was investigated only to sputter out into nothingness. "We're stretched too thin," Deputy Rachel Hensley admitted to Detective Michael Graves, as the two sat in the police station's cramped break room, the faint buzz of fluorescent lighting the only ambient noise. "I can't drive 5 blocks without someone stopping me to tell me they think they've cracked the case." Graves nodded absently, his gaze fixed on the case files accumulating on the desk before him. "It's the uncertainty," he muttered, almost to himself. "An unsolved murder. It seeds panic quicker than the act itself." Rachel exhaled deeply, rubbing her temples. "Do you think it'll get worse?" Graves glanced at her with a grim expression. "Panic doesn't just grow, it multiplies." As the police struggled to maintain order, the thin veil of civility that had once held Mason together began to fray. Tensions simmered under the surface, small arguments escalating quicker than usual. Conflicts erupted in HOA meetings. Why hadn't the community approved better lighting for poorly lit areas like Willow Creek Lane? Couples who had always agreed to disagree on matters of safety suddenly found themselves locked in heated debates. Should they stay or leave Mason? Could anyone be trusted? Predator or prey? The cherry on top of Mason's fragile state of morale came during a final week of March Town Hall. The auditorium at Mason Middle School had reached near capacity as Mayor Quinn Lawrence attempted to assuage fears. His speech followed the predictable beats. The local authorities were working tirelessly, the town was safe, no drastic measures were necessary, but the calm facade cracked when a woman named Donna Stewart stood up and introduced herself as Sarah Whitman's co-worker from the college art department. Her voice trembled as she addressed the crowd. "Why haven't there been arrests yet? How do we know? How do we know this person isn't already choosing another victim?" The murmurs rippling through the room quickly escalated into an uproar. Fearful residents heckled the mayor for answers while others demanded justice. Someone near the back shouted, "Get the FBI for Christ's sake!" Another young man stood to start a petition to speed up neighborhood patrols. Police Director Graves, who hadn't planned on addressing the audience, was forced to step in. Grabbing the mic in a steady hand, he said, "Let me be frank. This investigation is our top priority. While we provide updates as they unfold, we need the community's help, not in spreading fear, but in remaining vigilant. Someone knows something, even if it feels small. I promise you, no leads will go ignored." But promises weren't enough. That night, as doors slammed shut and houses battened down for evening, the question on every Mason resident's mind replayed itself. If Sarah wasn't safe, how could any of us be? Vigilante groups emerge. The paranoia that gripped Mason soon gave rise to its own phenomena, independent patrols organized by neighbors fed up with waiting for the police to deliver answers. These groups, described as safety coalitions, began organizing regular night watches. Armed with flashlights, whistles, and, in a few extreme cases, handguns, they wandered suburban streets like amateur detectives. The police issued a press release cautioning against such actions, stating that untrained individuals could put themselves at risk. But the warnings were largely ignored. A father of 3 working in one of the groups summed up the sentiment, "Look, I can't let my kids play out back anymore without worrying someone's out there. I'll be damned if I'm just going to sit back and hope for the best." And so, the amateur patrols patrolled, sometimes clashing with local officers over jurisdiction, and often causing more tension than they resolved. But the reality was this: feelings of safety were gone, replaced by restless anxiety. Mason, Ohio, was no longer the idyllic small-town postcard it once was. What no one suspected, what no one could even imagine, was that the killer was there among them, walking the same streets, blending into the chaos like a shadow hiding in plain sight. The second body is found. Just as the community of Mason, Ohio was beginning to adapt to living under the shadow of Sarah Whitman's murder, the unthinkable happened again. 2 weeks after Sarah's body had been discovered on Willow Creek Lane, trouble brewed on an overcast May morning. The kind of trouble that would extinguish whatever fragile sense of safety the town had just begun to rebuild. The call came into the Mason Police Department at 7:12 a.m. on May 3, 1993. A man's voice, panicked and trembling, came through the line. This is Alan Grayson," he stammered. I think you need to get down to the west parking lot off Mill Road. There's a body here. A woman, I don't think she's breathing. You should hurry." "Stay where you are, Mr. Grayson," the dispatcher instructed, her tone calm but firm. Her confidence barely masked the tension behind her voice. "Officers are on their way." The scene of horror. The West Mill Road parking lot wasn't a bustling area. Once a paved lot meant to service a now-defunct industrial plant, it had gone largely unused for a decade, abandoned to the elements. Now covered in weeds and surrounded by chain-link fences leaning askew, it had become a haunt for high schoolers sneaking beers and the occasional dog walker who ignored the no trespassing signs. It was not a place where anyone expected to stumble upon something so gruesome. Detective Michael Graves, who had barely sat down with his morning coffee when the call came in, arrived on the scene just after 7:30 a.m. Rain clouds hung heavy overhead, casting an eerie gray light on the surroundings. "Graves," Rachel Hensley flagged him down from beyond the line of squad cars and yellow tape, her face pale and drawn. "It's bad," she said quietly as he approached. She led him through the weeds to the far end of the lot where the forensics team had already begun taking photographs and measurements. There, near the edge of the cracked pavement, the lifeless body of a young woman lay sprawled, half hidden by a mess of overgrown grass and discarded trash. Graves paused, running a hand down his face, a familiar heaviness settling into his chest. "Christ," he muttered softly. The woman's body told a chilling tale. She was dressed in jeans and a pale blue blouse that had been torn in several places. Bruises and abrasions covered her arms, legs, and face. Her dark brown hair was knotted and matted with dirt, clinging eerily to the pale skin of her forehead. Around her neck, faint red ligature marks revealed the cause of her death: strangulation, just like Sarah Whitman. But what struck most of the detectives as they examined the scene was the calm, almost deliberate staging of the body. Her hands rested limply by her sides, and her head was tilted toward the sky, as if she had died while gazing up at the heavens. Next to her, a small backpack rested slightly ajar, its contents partially spilled but untouched. A few feet away lay a frayed piece of rope. "This isn't random," Graves murmured aloud to no one in particular, bending down just enough to get a closer look at the ligature marks. The tip of his pen hovered over the faint abrasions, but never touched the skin. "This son of a bitch is trying to say something." Rachel approached, holding a notepad. "She's clean, sir," she said, her voice uneasy. "No ID, no wallet, but we found a library card with the name Emily Parker. Matches her general description, early 20s. We're running her name now." Graves glanced at her, tension tightening his jaw. "Same pattern as Sarah Whitman," he muttered. "Young, alone, strangled, out of sight but staged just enough to be found." He glanced around at the abandoned lot. "Why here? Why this spot?" Rachel shook her head. "Maybe he knows this place gets little traffic, or maybe he doesn't care how long it takes for someone to find her. Or maybe," Graves thought grimly, "he wanted us to find her." Emily Parker, the victim. Within hours, detectives had confirmation. Emily Parker, 22 years old, was a junior at a nearby community college, majoring in environmental science. She had gone missing the previous evening after last being seen leaving the campus library. Her friends described her as kind-hearted and incredibly disciplined, a creature of habit who never failed to check in with her roommates when she left campus late at night. When she didn't return home, her roommates had called her parents, but it wasn't until Alan Grayson stumbled upon her body that her disappearance turned into a full-blown murder investigation. Graves listened quietly as Rachel relayed Emily's details back at the station. "She had no reason to be on Mill Road," Rachel said. "Her normal route back to her apartment is in the opposite direction." "Maybe she was following someone," Graves said quietly, not lifting his eyes from Emily's photo pinned to the investigation board. "Or maybe someone made her take that detour. The town's breaking point." As news of Emily Parker's murder spread, the fragile calm that Mason had precariously maintained since Sarah's death instantly shattered. Sarah's murder had been terrifying enough for the small suburban town, but now, with another young woman dead under horrifying circumstances, Mason's residents were no longer merely suspicious. They were downright terrified. Parents began escorting their children everywhere, even in the bright light of day. Community events were canceled, and the number of homes installing motion sensor floodlights doubled over the span of a week. Residents crowded the police station with frantic calls demanding answers and updates. For many, the realization hit hard. This wasn't just a crime, this was the beginning of something bigger. Even the media swarmed the streets, reporters stationed in every major thoroughfare chasing headlines like "Serial Killer Strikes Quiet Ohio Town" and "Terror Spreads in Mason." The term serial killer whispered among residents now boomed through primetime broadcasts. "It's like the whole town's waiting to see who's next," Rachel muttered one exhausted evening as she and Graves flipped through Emily's file yet again at the station. Graves didn't respond. Instead, his eyes were fixed on the evidence list. the rope found near Emily, the bruises, almost identical to Sarah's. The strange stillness in how both victims had been left behind, almost as if the killer believed their silence was part of the message. "Whoever this is," Graves finally said, his voice steady but grim, "he's just getting started. We're going to need every resource we've got." A chilling realization. 1 week into Emily's investigation, the first connections between the murders began to solidify. Preliminary tests confirmed that the ligature wounds on both Sarah Whitman and Emily Parker had been caused by similar material, nylon rope. Fibers from the rope matched fragments embedded in Sarah's neck, further suggesting that the same perpetrator was responsible for both killings. "There's no doubt about it now," Graves said during a late-night briefing. "This isn't a coincidence. We've got a serial offender, someone methodical, someone organized, and someone who knows how to vanish without a trace." The room fell into a tense silence. A room full of trained investigators, and yet no one had an answer for who or where this person could be. What haunted Graves most wasn't the lack of leads, it was what the killer wasn't doing. There were no ransom notes, no taunting letters to the police, no trophies stolen from the victims. Whoever this was, he wasn't like the killers Graves had studied in case files growing up. This wasn't about boasting, it was about control. And judging by the deliberate precision of the crime scenes, the killer wasn't just in control of his victims, he was in control of the entire town. Clues from the crime scene. The parking lot off Mill Road, now deemed the site of Emily Parker's gruesome murder, became Mason's grim center of attention. By daylight, the overgrown weeds and cracked asphalt seemed less sinister, but for Detective Graves, the place buzzed with an unseen tension. This wasn't just a lonely, decrepit spot on the outskirts of town anymore. It was a puzzle, one the killer had carefully constructed, piece by piece. Forensics teams, crime scene photographers, and officers patrolling the perimeter worked under the faint hum of insects in the morning heat. Every inch of the ground, every hint of disturbance was meticulously documented, yet Graves couldn't shake the feeling that they were already behind the killer. A rope and its secrets. The most obvious clue left behind at the scene was the frayed piece of rope found just a few feet away from Emily's body. The moment Graves saw it, he knew it was intentional, a breadcrumb left deliberately, or perhaps a taunt. "Bag it carefully," he had instructed the forensics team as they collected it. Days later in the lab, the first pieces of its story began to unfold. "This is some industrial-grade nylon," the lab tech, Megan Rosenthal, explained as Graves and Deputy Hensley hovered nearby. Megan was known for being thorough, which made her pauses all the more excruciating. She adjusted her gloves and squinted at the microscope. "It's not the kind of rope you'd find lying around in just any backyard shed. This is used for specialty applications like boating, rigging, construction." She looked up. "It's manufactured, not improvised." "So the killer either bought it for a specific purpose or already had access to it," Graves muttered, rubbing his jaw. "Can you trace its origin, any manufacturer marks or identifying traits?" Megan nodded but added, "We might not get a direct answer. This type of rope is widely used and thousands of companies sell it. What's interesting though is the fibers. There's residue embedded in the weave that suggests possible secondary usages, dust, an oil-based substance. I'll run further analysis," Hensley interjected, leaning against the counter. "A guy walking around with rope this cleanly cut isn't an accident. This has to be premeditated. He brought it with him." Graves grimaced. "He didn't just bring it, he left it on purpose." The implications hung heavy in the room. The rope wasn't a careless oversight, it was a calculated message. Hair and Fibers Detective Graves had learned a grim lesson over his years in homicide. Killers, no matter how methodical, inevitably left behind more than they realized. It wasn't about brute evidence like fingerprints or shoes. Sometimes, it was microscopic clues that cracked a case. On Emily's clothing and the patch of weeds where her body was found, the forensics team discovered several strands of hair. At first glance, the hairs didn't appear to belong to Emily. They were lighter in color and coarse. This small detail sent the lab techs into overdrive. "Human or animal?" Rachel Hensley asked as they stood in the department's evidence room later that week, examining the preliminary report. "Animal," Graves said, nodding to the report in his hand. "Stray animal hairs, most likely dog. They were lodged in the dirt near her jeans and under her sleeve." Hensley frowned. "Dog hairs? Could be a dog from around the parking lot?" Graves shook his head. "Maybe. Or maybe this sick bastard owns a dog and doesn't even realize he left evidence all over." The possibility was tantalizing. Dog hair meant breeds, potentially narrowing down suspects based on ownership. But it was just a hope, a thread, and Graves couldn't afford to indulge in optimism. The lab tech Megan confirmed later that evening that the hairs were from a German Shepherd or similar breed. Unfortunately, without DNA testing beyond the technology of 1993, tracing the hair further would be challenging. But it stuck in their heads. The killer, mingling within Mason, just might have a loyal four-legged companion. The unforgiving ground. The parking lot was inexplicably devoid of any tire tracks. No deep grooves or muddy impressions suggested where a vehicle pulled in or out. Yet such a barren, nondescript area had to be reached somehow, needlepoint precise in its isolation. "We didn't find any tire marks. He could have parked much farther away," Hensley had noted on site to Graves. "Everything's overgrown. Maybe he carried her?" "Or maybe," Graves replied, scanning the map of nearby roads and abandoned paths, "he's cunning enough to move on foot, carefully avoiding even the possibility of leaving something behind. Whoever this is, they're thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead." Despite that careful planning, the property hadn't let the killer get away entirely clean. Near the weeded outskirts was a patch of disturbed dirt just wide enough for suspicion. A shoe print, scuffed and light, had been left behind. Barely discernible, yet real nonetheless. A lingering oil scent. There was one detail that kept sticking in Graves' mind. When the body had first been recovered, there had been a faint scent near Emily, industrial, chemical, almost bitter. At first he assumed it might have come from the area's abandoned warehouse, but the examination of her clothes confirmed faint traces of a chemical residue. "We got something," said Megan, calling from the lab. "Smells like some sort of solvent, maybe paint thinner or motor oil. A faint coat covered the pants and one sleeve." "What the hell is he using paint thinner for?" Hensley asked when Graves brought it up during a brainstorming session. "Maybe it's profession-related," Graves answered slowly, "or a tool to clean up part of the scene. He's deliberate. He knows how to remove his trail." "This bastard planned it all, didn't he?" Hensley muttered, running her hand through her hair. "The parking lot, the body placement, he's cleaning up after himself, leaving only what he wants us to find." Graves nodded in agreement but pointed to the solvent note Megan circled. "But no one can clean everything, even careful killers exhaust patterns eventually. Puzzle pieces start to form." By the end of the week, the detectives and forensics team began stitching all the scattered evidence into a bigger picture. The rope, the animal hairs, the lack of struggle marks, the chemical residue. It painted the profile of someone who planned meticulously. He's either someone with access to these materials professionally, or someone who deliberately acquired exactly what he needed beforehand, Graves deduced during their team case meeting. Their biggest question, however, still echoed unanswered in the bullpen. Why? Rachel leaned back in her chair, staring at the board full of connecting notes between Emily Parker and Sarah Whitman's murders. 2 women, 2 different locations, 2 very calculated dumps. Do you think it's a pattern, or just random escalation? "It's a message," Graves replied grimly. His eyes lingered on one photo, the exact way Emily's hands had been laid by her sides. "We just aren't speaking his language yet." A chilling thought. With no witnesses and the killer clearly bent on control, the team faced an unsettling truth. Every step of his crime scenes, what little he left behind, was entirely intentional. With every thread of evidence, Detective Graves could feel the weight of those unseen steps closing around Mason. If this murderer was as methodical as the clues suggested, the next victim was already locked in their sights. And yet again, the town sat waiting. The killer strikes again. By June of 1993, the town of Mason, Ohio was not only gripped by fear, but immobilized by its own helplessness. 2 murders in the span of just over a month had shattered the illusion of safety that once defined life in the quiet suburb. Neighbors watched each other with suspicion. Streets that had once bustled with children's laughter grew disturbingly silent after sundown. And although detectives led door-to-door interviews and combed through every lead, the perpetrator of these gruesome crimes remained as elusive as a phantom in the night. For weeks the police department had been operating at breaking point. The investigation into Sarah Whitman and Emily Parker's murders was active, but concrete evidence tied to a suspect seemed as far away as ever. The fibers, the dog hair, the chemical traces on Emily's clothes, all pieces of the puzzle, but nothing provided enough clarity to narrow down the field. And then, just as the community began to think the killer might have moved on, he struck again. It was the evening of June 21st, 1993, when the nightmare escalated. The party that turned to horror. Laura Miller, 19 years old, was celebrating her summer break at her friend Allison's house just outside Mason's city limits. Friends described her as vibrant and sociable, always the life of the party, always carrying an infectious laugh. On that fateful night she danced and chatted, moving effortlessly through the crowd of college students who had gathered around the backyard fire pit. It was a carefree celebration in an increasingly oppressive time, the kind of night designed to push aside the lurking fear that hovered over the town. Around midnight, Laura told her friends she was heading home. "My mom'll kill me if I'm out much later," she joked over her shoulder before disappearing into the night. Her friends called out to her to stay, warning her not to take shortcuts, but she waved them off. Her home was only 10 minutes away by car and she knew the area, yet Laura never made it home. The following morning, panic erupted. Calls to her friends turned frantic when Laura's parents couldn't locate her. By late afternoon her family had contacted the police, pleading for help. Despite mustering everything in their power, officers were unable to locate her. Then, 2 days later, their worst fears were realized. The discovery. It was a jogger who stumbled upon Laura's body. He had taken a remote trail through Braden Park, an area often avoided at night because of overgrown paths and dense woods. At first it just looked like somebody was sleeping, the jogger later said in his statement to police. But the closer I got, I knew it wasn't right. Detective Michael Graves arrived at Braden Park before the coroner even made it to the scene. The sun was high, casting harsh shadows through the canopy of leaves as he walked toward the cluster of officers standing near the tree line. From a distance he could already see the now familiar signs. A hastily taped perimeter, reflective markers, and the somber hush of people who had seen too much. Rachel Hensley was waiting for him, her face creased with exhaustion. "It's her," she said simply, handing him the photo of Laura Miller that had been circulating since her disappearance. Graves lifted the tape and stepped under the canopy of trees, following Rachel's lead toward the body. Laura was lying flat on her back, her arms placed neatly at her sides, strangled, just like the others. Once again the killer had left her staged, almost reverently, as though presenting her as an offering. Her clothes were torn, bruises littered her pale skin, and her vacant eyes stared lifelessly at the branches above. "It's the same damn setup," Graves muttered, his voice tense. He crouched near her body, scanning the immediate area. Her purse was found nearby but untouched, stuffed with her ID, a few crumpled bills, and her school planner. A faint scuff mark could be seen on the dirt, one that would disappear under a closer inspection. Rachel knelt close to him. "We found no tire marks out here, but look at this." She gestured toward a faint indentation in the soft earth near a patch of crushed grass. "It's like something rested here. Could be the killer's equipment. Could be how he carried her." Graves straightened, running a hand over his face. "This guy keeps getting bolder, striking in public spaces. He doesn't care if we find them anymore. Hell, maybe he wants us to." Building patterns. Back at the precinct, Laura's photograph joined those of Sarah Whitman and Emily Parker on the investigation board. Graves and his team went through the crime details, the ligature marks, the deliberate pose, the lack of theft, and the similarities grew impossible to ignore. The killer had a pattern, but what it revealed only deepened the mystery. "Why her? What made her the target?" Graves asked aloud, pacing the room late into the night. Rachel folded her arms. "She walked home alone. That's the common thread, isn't it? These women were isolated, unprotected. He's watching, waiting for the moment he can strike. He picks them when he knows no one can interfere." "They're not just targets of opportunity, though," Graves countered, pausing in front of the board. "This level of staging, the deliberate act of leaving them as he does, it's more than a random grab. He wants control. These aren't women to him. They're pieces, symbols maybe." The room fell silent, heavy with the weight of his words. Panic explodes. If the murders of Sarah Whitman and Emily Parker had rattled Mason, Laura Miller's death shattered what fragile composure the town had left. By this point, serial killer wasn't just a term whispered over fences. It was screamed in bold headlines on the local and national news. The media storm grew relentless, reporters swarming police for answers, parents demanding justice in heated town hall meetings. Local businesses began closing early, and the streets became deserted long before nightfall. Joggers abandoned their routines entirely, and women in the community seldom left their homes alone. Gun sales surged once more, and some families packed up and left town altogether. Braden Park, once a place for picnics and summer baseball games, was now avoided entirely. Graves heard the whispers in the community. "The police can't stop him. This is our reality now. No one is safe." A killer's signature. In the days after Laura's murder, The forensics team began piecing together new evidence. Dirt samples from Braden Park revealed traces of the same industrial solvent found on Emily Parker's clothing. More nylon fibers were discovered near Laura's neck, strikingly similar to those from Sarah's and Emily's cases. Perhaps most intriguing, a single strand of dog hair was recovered from Laura's sleeve. "This guy is slipping," Rachel said one night as she and Graves studied the fiber and hair analysis. "Small stuff, sure, but if he keeps leaving these breadcrumbs, we'll catch something eventually." Graves wasn't so sure. "Or he knows we'll find this stuff. Maybe it's deliberate. He's playing with us. It's about being seen, on his terms." An unnerving revelation. By the end of June, a horrifying thought began forming in Graves' mind. This killer wasn't unpredictable. He was methodical, deliberate, and completely confident. He was likely an individual with some understanding of criminal investigations, someone who knew exactly how long to linger and when to disappear. "This isn't going to stop," Graves told Rachel one quiet evening at the precinct. "Not until we stop him. He's already lining up the next victim and we're still crawling through his trail." The realization weighed heavily on Graves. For every carefully staged act of violence, for every clue that seemed more like a mocking nod to the investigators, it was clear. The killer wasn't just hiding among them, he wanted them to know he was always a step ahead. And so, Mason braced itself for the inevitable. The killer's game wasn't over, it wasn't even slowing down. A growing suspicion inside the force. By late June 1993, as fear tightened its grip on Mason, the police department found itself walking a razor-thin line. The investigation into the 3 murders had hit obstacles, the killer's trail constantly evaporating just as the detectives believed they were closing in. But amid the overwhelming stress of the case, another darker suspicion began to surface, one that no one wanted to acknowledge. Could someone inside their own ranks be involved, a killer who knows too much? It started as a murmur, a thought that crept its way into silent stares and sleepless nights. Detective Michael Graves was the first to articulate what others were only beginning to wonder. "This guy's too careful," Graves said one evening in the cramped detective bullpen. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered faintly, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Only Rachel Hensley was with him, her notepad open, though she'd stopped taking notes a while ago. "Careful how?" she asked, her voice cautious but curious. Graves leaned back in his chair, the weight of the case etched into his features. "No mistakes. No real mistakes anyway. He's not just covering his tracks, he's erasing them. No fingerprints, no tire marks, no bloodstains, even the fibers and dog hair we found. They're deliberate. He wants us to find them. He's leading us down a path he's chosen." Rachel frowned. "You think he's, what, mocking us?" Graves nodded slowly. "Mocking us, yeah, but it's more than that. Whoever this is, they understand how investigations work. They know the process. They know our process." He paused, pinching the bridge of his nose. "And that scares the hell out of me." Rachel's pen hovered over her notepad, but she didn't write anything down. "Are you saying he's one of us?" Her voice dropped to a whisper as though uttering the thought aloud might make it real. "I don't know," Graves admitted, but his eyes were dark, troubled. "I just can't shake the feeling. This guy isn't some amateur. He's precise, methodical. He knows where to leave evidence and where not to. He knows how long it'll take us to run tests, how much time we'll waste chasing false leads like that German Shepherd hair. If he's not one of us, he's damn close." Missing leads and questionable gaps. The idea of an insider quickly gained traction when unexplained discrepancies started cropping up in the investigation. A key report misfiled, a piece of evidence missing from an evidence locker, only to reappear days later. A witness who claimed they'd seen a man matching the killer's description, but whose statement was never formally logged. Graves dismissed the first incident as clerical error, the second as a simple mistake, but by the third, he could no longer ignore the pattern. "We're bleeding leads," Graves muttered to Rachel one morning, frustration boiling deep in his voice. He slapped a hand down on the latest report, an incomplete follow-up that should have included interviews with 2 of Laura Miller's college friends. "How does this happen? We're not amateurs." Rachel looked over the document, her own skepticism etched into her features. "Someone dropped the ball," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. "Or," she hesitated, as if afraid of finishing the sentence, "or someone deliberately dropped it." Graves finished for her. He pushed the paper aside and stood, pacing the small room. He didn't want to give voice to what was spinning in his mind, but it was growing harder to suppress. Someone within their department could be feeding the killer information, or worse, could be the killer. Lingering shadows of the past. What made the suspicion sting harder was the department's own history. Mason wasn't a crime-riddled town, but it also wasn't immune to scandals. 5 years earlier, Officer Robert Young had been quietly forced out of the department after allegations of excessive force during an altercation with a suspect. Officially, he'd resigned for personal reasons, but the truth was whispered over coffee and in back rooms. Though no charges were ever filed against him, his dismissal left a stain on the department's reputation. "Do you think it could be someone like Young?" Rachel asked Graves as they pored over the case notes late one night. "Someone with experience, but a twisted streak?" "Maybe," Graves muttered, not looking up from the crime scene photos pinned to the board. "But I don't want to focus too narrowly. Whoever this son of a bitch is, they're tactical, careful, and if they're one of us, or were one of us, they'd know exactly how to navigate this." He motioned toward Rachel. "Remember what Young used to say?" Rachel sat back, frowning in thought before recalling the phrase. "Always think like the criminal to catch the criminal," she said, her tone tinged with bitterness. "Exactly." Graves leaned against the desk and crossed his arms. What if he took that lesson a little too literally? Examining friendly faces. The department was small, with fewer than 30 sworn officers, detectives, and administrative staff. Everyone knew everyone, or so they thought. In cities like Mason, trust was practically a currency, and the idea that one of their own might be responsible for such horror felt like a betrayal, even in the abstract. Graves began subtly scrutinizing his colleagues. He paid attention to who was quick to offer theories, who seemed overly eager to handle certain pieces of evidence. He watched how people spoke about the case, especially when they thought no one was really listening. Most officers were visibly shaken by the murders, talking openly about their fears for their families, their frustrations with the lack of progress. But a few seemed detached, reserved in ways that unsettled him. One officer in particular, Barry Keene, had a way of hanging back during meetings. Barry was quiet by nature, the kind of person who did his job efficiently but didn't draw attention to himself. He'd been with the department for 8 years, his record spotless. But in the last few weeks, Graves had noticed something strange. Barry didn't talk about the murders like everyone else. He didn't speculate or share frustration. When asked his opinion, his answers were brief, calculated. "Do you think Keene's acting weird?" Rachel asked casually one afternoon as though reading Graves's mind. Graves paused, his pen hovering over a case file. "Weird how?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted, "just off, like he knows something but doesn't want to say it." Graves nodded, his own suspicions aligning with hers. "I've thought about it, but with guys like Barry, it could just be the way he's processing everything. Not everyone wears it on their sleeve." Rachel hesitated, then leaned in closer. "And what if he's not processing it at all? What if it's because he knows?" An uncomfortable dilemma. The thought of investigating their own department was a line Graves wasn't ready to cross. To accuse one of their own without proof, it would shatter what little trust was left among the force. But the evidence, or lack thereof, kept circling back to the unsettling possibility. "What do we do?" Rachel asked one night after another dead-end lead had derailed their momentum. She was starting to look as tired as Graves felt, and the weight of their suspicions loomed large between them. "For now we keep it tight," Graves said firmly. "You and me. We keep digging, but we don't breathe a word about this theory until we're absolutely sure. If it's true, if one of us is involved, we need to be damn careful." "And if it's not true?" Rachel asked. Graves exhaled heavily, letting the silence speak for him. If they were wrong, it could tear the department apart. If they were right, the killer was closer than any of them realized. With mounting pressure from the community and their trust in each other slowly unraveling, Graves and Rachel had no choice but to keep pushing forward. Whoever this killer was, they weren't just attacking Mason's victims, they were dismantling the very foundation of the department itself, and Graves could feel the clock ticking down to the next tragic phone call. The legal battle against time. By the summer of 1993, the town of Mason, Ohio was not just in mourning, it was desperate for justice. With 3 young women's lives brutally snatched away, trust in the police department had eroded to a dangerous low. The spotlight of national and local media burned on the investigation, casting long shadows of doubt across every corner of the case. Underneath this pressure cooker of expectations, the burden for Detective Michael Graves and Deputy Rachel Hensley was not just catching the killer, it was proving him guilty in a courtroom before time, resources, and public patience ran out. What had started as an unsettling murder investigation had now spiraled into a grueling legal race, a labyrinth of forensics, bureaucracy, and courtroom procedure where the smallest mistake could spell disaster. The bodies of Karen and Megan Johnson. Then, in August 1993, the investigation into Mason's mysterious killer took a grim and horrifying turn. The discovery of two bodies in a remote wooded area outside of town shocked even the most resilient members of the community. Karen Johnson, 20, and her older sister Megan Johnson, 23, had been missing for 2 weeks when a hiker stumbled upon their remains atop a hillside. The murder of two victims at once made it clear. The killer was escalating, and he was doing so with grim confidence. "God damn it!" Graves cursed under his breath as he stood over the recovery site, the stench of decay and overturned soil permeating the humid August air. He couldn't shake the feeling that the killer wanted them to find this scene. Two sisters, their bodies dumped together, marked a level of brazenness that set his teeth on edge. Both women had suffered brutal strangulation, their necks bearing the now familiar ligature marks. Just as in previous cases, there were hints of staged presentation, their hands folded across their stomachs and their shoes carefully placed at their sides, as though arranged by some twisted funeral director. Rachel Hensley arrived minutes later, visibly shaken despite her usual steely resolve. "Jesus, Mike," she said, staring at the bodies. "Two of them! How does he do this? Get them both at once?" "They trusted the wrong person," Graves muttered, almost to himself, "or he stalked them long enough to know exactly when to strike." This time, however, the killer had left behind traces, small but significant. Strands of coarse dog hair, matching the fibers previously found on Emily's and Laura's bodies, were embedded in both victims' clothing. There was also something else, a few strands of hair, this time human, blonde and thin, and definitely not belonging to either Karen or Megan. "This is it," Rachel whispered urgently back at the department's evidence lab later. "If we can match this hair to someone, we might finally get him." But there was an all-too-familiar catch, the limit of forensics in 1993. In today's world, these small strands of hair might lead to an answer in hours or days, thanks to advanced DNA testing. But in 1993, the science of DNA profiling, while celebrated as revolutionary, was painfully slow and limited. Processing samples could take months, and the technology was nowhere near as efficient or widespread as it is now. Worse still, the potential hair root attached to the samples was too fragile for early-stage DNA extraction processes. Graves, who had spent countless hours poring over painstakingly slow matches between fibers and residue, was growing more impatient by the day. "How long do they need to test it?" Rachel asked during a tense conversation with the state crime lab. The technician over the phone sighed heavily before responding. "We're slammed, Hensley. Right now you're looking at 6 to 8 months for a possible match, if we can even extract the DNA at all. I hate telling you this, but you're not our only case." Rachel held the phone against her forehead and cursed softly before saying, "We don't have 6 months. We're losing people." The urgency wasn't just about finding the killer. They needed something solid to present in the rapidly escalating legal battle looming ahead. The Johnson family brings the fight. The Johnson family was devastated, their grief transforming into an unrelenting need for answers. Karen and Megan's parents, Ellen and Greg Johnson, went public with their frustrations, appearing on local news and vowing to hold both the killer and the authorities accountable. "This town isn't safe," Ellen said through tears during an interview on Channel 7 News. "If they can't catch him, what's going to stop him from taking more of our daughters? Our sisters, nieces, friends? We deserve justice, and we deserve it now." Their words resonated with a community already battered by fear. Protesters gathered outside the Mason Police Department with handmade signs, "Catch him before it's too late." Others demanded the FBI take over the investigation, launching heated debates across newspapers and radio shows. Graves felt the weight of that pressure every time he walked through town. People stared, shopkeepers hesitated when he came in for coffee, and the unspoken judgment in their eyes made him feel like he was dying small deaths every day. "We don't have the luxury to fumble this," he told Rachel as they pored over the mounting case files one late night. "The Johnsons want a resolution, but if we hand over something half-baked to the courts and it falls apart under scrutiny, he walks free, or worse, it teaches him to be even smarter." Rachel nodded, though her usual fire was dimmed after weeks without sleep or progress. "We need him nailed to the wall, Mike. No doubts, no loopholes. We can't afford a mistrial, or an acquittal." A growing rift between law and justice. As summer dragged on, tensions between law enforcement and prosecution flared. The district attorney's office was adamant. Without compelling new evidence, they wouldn't push for an arrest. The hair might not even be his, ADA Linda Barrett argued when Graves presented their findings at a closed-door meeting. If it doesn't give us direct proof that ties him to the exact time and place of the murders, the defense will rip us apart in court. And what about the dog hairs? Rachel snapped back. The fibers, the solvents, the pattern. This isn't circumstantial, it's deliberate. Sure, Barrett said calmly, folding her hands. But deliberate isn't enough unless you can convince 12 jurors beyond a shadow of a doubt. Do you want to gamble on putting him behind bars for a week, or do you want to bury him for life? Because that's the choice. Her voice lowered. Get me something airtight. Graves left that meeting feeling like he was sinking in quicksand. The legal system was supposed to be their ally, but it felt like another obstacle in an already impossible race. Ticking time bomb. As August gave way to September, the team's focus grew sharper. Every scrap of evidence, every report was reanalyzed, re-examined, and viewed through the lens of how it might hold up in court. They couldn't afford slip-ups, not even the smallest oversight. The clock was ticking, and Graves knew the killer wasn't waiting for them. He wasn't hiding. He was lurking, growing darker and bolder each day. I'll tell you one thing, Graves said to Rachel one restless night as they stared at the investigation board. Time's not on our side. But this guy, he's just fine running the clock. Rachel turned to him, her voice grim. We've got to grab this bastard before the law shreds our work, because if we don't, someone else in this town isn't going to make it to Christmas. And with that sobering reality hanging over their heads, Graves and his team pressed forward, knowing the killer's next move might be the one to finally tip the scales, or destroy them completely. The killer's mistake. It happened the way it often does in cases like this. One subtle miscalculation, one overlooked detail, and a methodical predator's carefully constructed facade began to crack. After months of chasing shadows, mounting pressure, and an increasingly emboldened killer, Detective Michael Graves and Deputy Rachel Hensley finally caught a break, but not through traditional detective work. No, this breakthrough came thanks to an entity the killer had underestimated: technology, a clue, from a gas station. The break came from an unsuspecting source. A grainy surveillance tape from a small, rundown gas station just a few miles from where Karen and Megan Johnson's bodies were found. The gas station, which catered mostly to truckers and highway traffic, often went overlooked by investigators due to its remote location and shoddy security equipment. But on a whim, one junior officer had decided to canvass the area and collect any potential footage that might have been recorded near the time of the sisters' deaths. Graves wasn't expecting much when the VHS tape arrived on his desk. Just another half hour of static and headlights, he muttered sarcastically to Rachel. Still, with nothing else yielding results, he loaded the tape into the ancient TV setup in the precinct's media room. At first it seemed exactly as Graves expected: blurry headlights rolling into the lot, indistinct figures entering the station, and occasional glitches in the recording. Then, at 11:23 p.m. on July 19th, the night Karen and Megan were believed to have been abducted, something changed. A shadowy figure could be seen stepping out of a dark sedan at one of the pumps. The quality of the tape made it hard to identify key details, but Graves's sharp eye caught something critical in the shaky footage. He leaned forward, squinting. "Pause it!" he shouted to Rachel, who stood fiddling with the playback controls. The screen froze and Graves pointed to the license plate, partially visible in the flickering frame. "It's not a full number," Rachel said, trying to manage her expectations. "But it's something. If we can run it through DMV records and cross-match it with that vehicle model." Graves nodded, his expression dark. "We've got ourselves a lead." The dark sedan. The partial plate was traced back to several possible matches, but one in particular sent a chill through the precinct. It belonged to Robert Young, a former Mason police officer who had left the force nearly 5 years prior after a string of troubling incidents. Graves pulled Young's file immediately. It didn't take long for memories of Robert's departure to resurface. The man had been volatile during his time on the force, known for a blend of charisma that masked a much darker side. While his official record showed no convictions, the rumors surrounding his behavior painted a far more sordid picture. "Robert Young," Rachel read aloud as she scanned his file. "Why does this name feel like it's been sitting under our noses the whole time?" "Because it has," Graves replied grimly. "This guy didn't just leave the force. He was quietly pushed out. And I don't think he's been far from Mason all these years." Robert's address, still current in the DMV database, listed a small home on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet part of Mason, surrounded by thick trees and long dirt roads, perfectly isolated for someone who wanted to lay low. "We might have found our guy, Rachel," Graves said, the tension in his voice unmistakable. "But we can't just go pounding down his door on this tape alone," Rachel replied, though her excitement mirrored his. "We need more. We need to tie him directly to the murders." Graves nodded. "That's the plan." Dismantling his perfect crime, over the following days, the team began dissecting every aspect of Robert Young's life. Surveillance teams were set up to monitor his movements, quietly tailing him as he went about his mundane daily routines. Former co-workers from the force were interviewed, those he hadn't already alienated, and old complaints from civilians were scrutinized for new relevance. What they found was both disturbing and enlightening. Robert was meticulous. He lived alone. He had no close family ties, no friends who visited regularly, and no clear alibi during the nights of the murders. His background in law enforcement gave him an intimate understanding of investigative procedures, and it became increasingly evident just how well he'd used that knowledge to evade suspicion. "He's been playing us," Rachel said one evening in the bullpen, throwing a stack of papers onto the desk. "This whole time, he's been relying on us not looking inward. It's the perfect cover. He understands our blind spots. But even perfect criminals make mistakes." For Robert Young, it was underestimating the level of scrutiny his vehicle, and his routine, would receive once flagged by the gas station footage. The dog hair connection. Another key break tied directly to Robert. While the fibers in dog hair found at the crime scenes hadn't been conclusive enough to identify him outright, a deeper dive into Robert's life revealed he owned a dog, a German Shepherd no less. The animal had been regularly taken to a local veterinarian for years, and his name, Max, was even listed on old licensing forms. Graves tensed as this detail came to light. "How the hell did we miss this before?" Rachel smirked faintly and countered. "Because the guy's good. He didn't keep Max out when he didn't need to. Probably kenneled him during the murders to avoid leaving fresh evidence. But evidence doesn't age out of relevance. A subpoena for the hair samples collected from Max's visits to the vet clinched the connection. Forensics analyzed the strands and confirmed a match, tracking the dog hair to those found on the bodies of Emily Parker and Laura Miller. Closing in. With the evidence mounting, Graves and his team began building the case they needed to bring Robert in. The gas station footage, the dog hair, the nylon rope tied to construction supplies Robert had recently purchased, all of it painted a chilling portrait of a man who was once part of the same system he'd managed to outfox. "He thought he was smarter than us," Rachel said during their preparations. "And hell, maybe he was for a while, but hubris kills, Mike. It always does." "It's not just about him thinking he's smarter," Graves replied, his voice low and steady. "He thinks we're too tied up by procedure to catch someone like him. He's going to find out just how wrong he is." The arrest. The moment finally came on an unseasonably cool morning in late August. Armed with an arrest warrant, the Mason Police Department stormed Robert Young's home, catching him off guard as he stepped onto his porch to retrieve the morning paper. He didn't resist when officers cuffed him, though the look in his eyes, a mix of arrogance and disdain, told Graves everything he needed to know. As they drove him back to the station, Robert broke his silence only once, leaning slightly toward Graves in the passenger seat. "You don't know the half of it, Detective," he said, his voice calm and icy, as though already daring them to uncover even more. But Graves didn't flinch. He turned slowly to meet Robert's gaze and replied, "We'll see." DNA evidence, and the killer's downfall. By the winter of 1993, the once bustling town of Mason, Ohio, was an eerie shell of itself. Christmas lights flickered half-heartedly on quiet suburban streets, but no one was in the mood for celebration. The murderer had been captured. Robert Young, the disgraced ex-cop, turned a nightmare, but the community's wounds were raw, and justice felt like it was still out of reach. Even with Young sitting in a holding cell, smirking at anyone who dared to make eye contact, the case against him was far from airtight. Without direct evidence tying Young to the crime scenes at the exact times of the murders, the legal team feared this wouldn't end with a clean conviction. A single crack in the case could set him loose, free to walk the streets of Mason or any other unsuspecting town. Detective Michael Graves knew this all too well. He had broken through Young's smug veneer during questioning, but the man's knowledge of police procedure and legal loopholes gave him a shield stronger than steel. There was no way the jury would convict based purely on circumstantial evidence, not without the kind of proof a killer could never contest: DNA, a fragile lifeline. The forensic technology of 1993 was breathtaking for its time, but it was also painfully slow. DNA profiling, though revolutionary, was still evolving and required months-long wait times for results. The strands of hair and fibers found on the victims, evidence Graves believed to be critical, were now sitting in a state crime lab, awaiting analysis. And time, as it always seemed to be in this case, was not on their side. "How long do they need? Weeks? Months?" Rachel Hensley asked during a tense meeting with the district attorney. "We've got this guy in custody, but for how long? People are going to lose their patience. The Johnson family is already calling every day, asking when we're going to put him on trial." Graves's voice was heavy as he leaned forward in his chair. "Linda, we're telling you, the DNA is the key. That hair at the scene, it wasn't the victim's. It's his. Couple that with the dog hair matches, no way he walks out of here." Ada Linda Barrett pressed her hands flat on the desk and looked directly at Graves. "You're assuming we get the DNA results back before pre-trial. And even if we do, you know how the defense is going to spin this. They'll poke every damn hole they can in the chain of custody, the testing process, and the validity of early DNA protocols. We need more than assumptions." Rachel, always quicker to anger than Graves, slammed her fist on the table. "Then we fight like hell. We don't just give them the DNA. We build everything around it. The rope fibers, the dog hairs, the gas station footage, all of it. We make this case so airtight that his lawyer won't find a crack if they had a goddamn microscope." Graves nodded slowly. "She's right. If we wait, we lose momentum, and the town sees a murderer walk free." Barrett sighed in frustration. "Fine, get me everything, and I mean everything." The breakthrough. As December crept closer, the long-awaited call came in. Late one frigid afternoon, Graves sat hunched in his office, staring at the cluttered case file while Rachel skimmed over handwritten notes. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet. Graves snatched the receiver. "Detective Graves." On the other end, Megan Rosenthal, the lead forensic analyst from the state lab, spoke with a breathless urgency. "Mike, we got it." Graves straightened in his chair. Rachel shot him a sharp look, already knowing what it had to be. "DNA?" Graves asked. "Yeah," Megan confirmed. "The hair samples you sent? They're a match. No doubt about it. Robert Young. The mitochondrial sequence on the hair from Emily Parker's and Laura Miller's scenes is unique to him." Graves exhaled hard, his heart pounding. "What about the victim's clothes? The dog hair?" "We were able to confirm the presence of Max's hair, the German Shepherd," Megan added, her voice steady but grim. "We matched it to the samples you subpoenaed from his vet records. It was all over their clothing." Graves leaned back, rubbing his temples. "This is it," he murmured. "This is what seals it." Rachel's brow arched. "We've got him dead to rights," she said, already reaching for the phone. "Let's call Barrett." "Hold up," Graves cut in, raising his hand. "What else, Megan? Is any of this at risk of contamination or challenge?" "Not from our end," Megan said. "The chain of custody is solid. You followed procedure to the letter, but keep in mind this is still 93. His defense attorney is going to question the science behind mitochondrial DNA. If they bring in some so-called expert to muddy the water on the stand—" "We'll deal with it," Graves interrupted firmly. "You did your part, thanks Megan." As he hung up, he locked eyes with Rachel. Neither of them spoke for a moment. They didn't need to. Every piece was finally falling into place, but the weight of what lay ahead loomed just as heavy, cracks in the monster's armor. With the DNA evidence ready to present, Graves and Rachel returned to interrogate Robert Young, this time armed with ammunition they knew would shake him. Young greeted them with the same blank expression, leaning back in his chair with the smug energy of a man who believed he still held the upper hand. But Graves wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. "We ran the DNA," Graves began, placing a thick folder of results on the metal table before him. "You know what we found?" Young's eyes flickered just for a moment, then he shrugged. "Let me guess. Fibers, dust, dirt, you're trying way too hard, detective." Rachel leaned forward, her loose ponytail falling over her shoulder. "We found your hair, Robert. On Emily Parker, on Laura Miller, strands so distinct, you might as well have signed your name on their bodies." Young stiffened slightly, his jaw tightening, but he stayed silent. "And who loves you, huh?" Rachel continued, her voice venomous as she reached for another folder. "Your dog, Max. You remember him, right? The hair we found on the victims, Robert. It wasn't just any random German Shepherd, it was your goddamn dog." The chill in Young's eyes flickered, and for the first time, the mask of arrogance cracked. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped. "You think you've got me?" he hissed. Graves met his gaze evenly. "No, Robert, I know we do." a community's vindication. In March of 1994, Robert Young stood trial for the murders of Sarah Whitman, Emily Parker, Laura Miller, and the Johnson sisters. The courtroom was packed with grieving families, reporters, and an entire town thirsting for justice. The DNA evidence, the dog hair, the nylon rope, all of it was presented with meticulous precision, leaving no room for doubt. Despite his defense team's best efforts to challenge the reliability of early DNA testing, the jury was unmoved. On the 15th day of the trial, the verdict came down. Guilty, on all counts. As the judge read the sentence, death by lethal injection, Young sat emotionless, his head slightly bowed. But for Mason's residents, the moment marked not just the end of Young's reign of terror, but the beginning of a long, slow process of healing. Outside the courthouse, Rachel stood beside Graves, watching as a crowd of quiet, solemn faces gathered to hear the verdict. "It's over," Rachel said softly. Graves nodded, though the lines etched into his face told a more complicated story. "For them," he replied. "Maybe not for us." Rachel glanced at him. "We just stopped a monster, Mike. That's enough for today." Graves didn't answer, staring into the distance as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in months, Mason had seen justice. But part of him wondered how many more Robert Youngs were still out there, hiding in plain sight. The trial that shocked the nation. On March 14, 1994, the once small, quiet town of Mason became the epicenter of a legal storm that gripped the nation. All eyes turned to the packed courtroom at the Warren County Courthouse, where Robert Young, the former cop turned serial killer, sat at the defendant's table. The trial was a spectacle, a clash of justice and evil that would captivate news networks for weeks. For the victims' families, this was not just the trial of a killer, it was a trial of the system itself, one that had allowed a predator to move among them undetected for so long. The atmosphere in the courthouse was electric, charged with raw emotion that simmered just beneath the surface. The prosecution, armed with DNA evidence, damning forensic connections, and an airtight case, was ready to deliver justice. The defense, on the other hand, came armed with doubt, a weapon just sharp enough to carve cracks in even the most solid argument. Detective Michael Graves and Deputy Rachel Hensley sat silently in the back of the courtroom, observing every word, every facial expression, every reaction. For them, this was the culmination of everything, every sleepless night, every setback, and every haunting memory of the women they'd failed to save in time. But now, the evidence had spoken, and it was time for justice to roar. The opening statements. ADA. Linda Barrett delivered her opening statement with a composure that belied the fire raging just below the surface of her calm demeanor. She stood before the jury, her sharp navy blue suit pressed to perfection, exuding confidence and purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady, charging the room with her presence. "Robert Young was once entrusted to uphold the law. He wore a badge. He swore an oath to protect and serve the people of Mason, to protect women like Sarah Whitman, Emily Parker, Laura Miller, and Karen and Megan Johnson. But instead, he broke that oath in the most unforgivable way possible, by turning the people he was meant to protect into his prey." Barrett paused, scanning the faces of the jurors, letting her words settle. "What we present to you in this trial will not be pleasant. It will not be easy to hear. But it will leave you with no doubt that Robert Young is responsible for the brutal murders of 5 young women, murders that terrified this community, shattered families, and scarred Mason forever." She then meticulously laid out the prosecution's case, the DNA evidence, the hair samples, the rope fibers, the dog hair traced to Young's German Shepherd Max, and even behavior patterns that underscored his chilling methods. "Evidence doesn't lie," Barrett said, her voice firm as she leaned toward the jury, "and the evidence will prove that Young's manipulations and his attempts to elude justice have come to an end." Then it came time for the defense. Young's lead attorney, Charles Lancaster, stood and adjusted his spectacles. He was a master of detail, a man who'd made his career poking holes in seemingly watertight cases, and now he was defending the indefensible. "What the prosecution wants you to believe," he began, his southern drawl rich and deliberate, "is that this mountain of so-called evidence amounts to one thing, certainty, but what they will never be able to escape is reasonable doubt." His voice was calm, methodical, as he began to weave his web. "Reasonable doubt is what protects all of us, ladies and gentlemen, and in this case what you'll see is a lot of little threads, tiny hairs, excuses for DNA science they don't fully understand, the behavior of a dog." Each thread by itself may seem strong, but you'll find that they don't quite connect, and if so much as one of those threads snaps—" Lancaster paused, drawing out his words for maximum effect. "You cannot convict a man as guilty when there's room for doubt." Rachel leaned over to Graves as Lancaster continued. "He's playing the flimsy science card," she whispered, her voice biting with tension. Graves frowned. "Let him. This isn't 1975. The DNA alone will bury this bastard." The testimony of families and forensics. Over the coming weeks, the prosecution called a parade of witnesses, including forensic analysts, medical examiners, and even local veterinarians who testified about Max's dog hair matches. Each detail was painstakingly laid out for the jury, creating a mosaic of Robert Young's guilt. But it was the testimony of the victims' families that left the courtroom silent and raw. First came Ellen and Greg Johnson, parents of Karen and Megan Johnson. Ellen trembled as she clutched the stand, her hands gripping tightly to the sides. Her voice cracked as she described her daughter's hopes, their love for life, and how they were taken from her. "They were my light," Ellen said, tears streaming freely down her face. "You don't ever think you'll outlive your children. And then, to lose them in such a way, it tears you to pieces. And I know it was him." Her eyes burned with conviction as they landed on Young, whose expression remained eerily calm. When Robert Whitman, Sarah's father, was called to the stand, his testimony cut into the courtroom like a knife. "I sent my daughter out into a world I thought was safe," he said, choking back emotion. "But she wasn't safe. None of these girls were, and he has to answer for that." The defense, led by Lancaster, pressed these grieving family members with clinical detachment. They questioned time gaps in testimony, behavior before the disappearances, and even whether certain details could have been misremembered in the wake of their grief. The intention was clear, to insert fragments of doubt, but in doing so, Lancaster had to tread carefully, lest the jury see the defense's callousness as cruelty. The DNA evidence, the crown jewel. Megan Rosenthal, the forensic analyst who had worked tirelessly on the case, was perhaps the most important witness for the prosecution. Her testimony regarding the DNA evidence was calm, scientific, and unflinchingly clear. "The hair samples taken from Laura Miller's and Emily Parker's crime scenes," Rosenthal stated, holding up magnified photographs of the strands on a screen, "match the mitochondrial DNA sequence of the defendant, Robert Young." Lancaster immediately pounced, standing to cross-examine Rosenthal. "Miss Rosenthal, you'd agree, wouldn't you, that mitochondrial DNA cannot uniquely identify one individual? It can only identify that an individual shares DNA with others in the same maternal lineage, correct?" Rosenthal didn't flinch. "That is correct, Mr. Lancaster, but the probability of sharing this particular mitochondrial sequence within the general population is less than 0.05%. Combined with hair strand structure, morphology, and physical context, the likelihood that it belongs to anyone other than Robert Young is negligible." Lancaster smirked. "Negligible, not impossible." Barrett stood. "Objection. The defense is deliberately misrepresenting the statistical relevance." The judge nodded. "Sustained." Graves clenched his fists in the back of the room. The facts were on their side, but Lancaster's verbal acrobatics threatened to distort them just enough for the jury. Still, Rosenthal's testimony, from the DNA to the dog hair to the nylon fiber ties, was unshakable. It became the backbone of the prosecution's case. The moment of reckoning. On April 9, 1994, after 2 days of deliberations, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The silence could have suffocated the room. Rachel's palms were sweaty as she gripped the armrests of her seat. Graves sat stiffly beside her, his jaw tight. "All rise," the bailiff called. The foreperson stood, holding the jury's verdict. "On the charge of the murder of Sarah Whitman, we find the defendant, Robert Young, guilty." The word hung in the air like a bell ringing through a storm. One by one, the verdicts were read for each of the 5 victims, each one guilty. Young sat motionless, his face unreadable, but everyone in that room knew this was the end for him. The judge handed down the sentence later that afternoon: death by lethal injection. Outside the courthouse, as reporters swarmed and cameras flashed, Rachel turned to Graves. "We did it." Graves nodded, a rare flicker of relief crossing his face, but his voice carried a weight. "For them," he said, "but now the hard part's over. It's time for this town to heal." Rachel glanced at him and followed his gaze toward the crowd of grieving families. Maybe now they can. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, illuminating the courthouse steps, The people of Mason finally felt a sliver of justice. The monster was caged, and life, though forever changed, could begin to rebuild. Lessons and reforms. The arrest and conviction of Robert Young brought a semblance of closure to Mason, Ohio, but the scars it left behind ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. The case had not just ravaged families and shaken the community, it had exposed glaring weaknesses in law enforcement systems, investigative protocols, and the very foundation of institutional trust. As the courtroom lights dimmed for the final time and the nation moved on to its next headline, the people of Mason found themselves grappling with one sobering truth. The monster, for all his cunning and cruelty, had not acted alone. The cracks in the system had been his silent accomplice, and now they had to call their own failures into question. The badge as a shield. For Detective Michael Graves and Deputy Rachel Hensley, the aftermath of the trial wasn't a sigh of relief, it was a moment for reckoning. Sitting side by side in the police station's break room just days after the sentencing, their faces carried the exhaustion of people who had stared into the abyss and barely made it back. "You know what still keeps me up at night?" Rachel started, staring into her coffee cup as if the answer might be swimming inside. Graves didn't look up from the case file he couldn't seem to stop rereading. "We caught the bastard." "We did," she acknowledged, her voice edged with frustration. "But we let him live like a ghost in plain sight for years. He walked out of this building, Mike. Practically shook our hands before he went off and started killing." Forensic breakthroughs and DNA matches had painted Robert Young as the stone-cold killer, but his past in the Mason police force had made it all the more chilling. A badge hadn't just been a job for him, it had been a shield. He had learned how to manipulate systems, how to cover his tracks, and how to exploit the slow grind of bureaucracy for his own horrific ends. Graves leaned back in his chair, finally meeting Rachel's eyes. "We trusted the wrong people for too long, that's on us." But it wasn't just about Robert Young, it was about what he represented. A system that could insulate and protect the very people it was meant to hold accountable was now under the microscope. Institutional blind spots. The revelations about Young's time on the force sparked outrage that spread far beyond the borders of Mason. How could someone with a history of questionable behavior, someone who had been quietly dismissed after multiple accusations of misconduct, go on to become one of the town's most diabolical predators? The whispers of his dark side had been there all along. Complaints made by civilians had disappeared into filing cabinets. Rumors among colleagues had been brushed off as gossip. Even when his outbursts became too visible to ignore, the department's decision had been to push him out quietly rather than confront the rot head-on. Rachel tapped her pen against the table as she scrolled through archived reports from years ago. "This one," she said, pointing at a faded incident log. "Why wasn't this flagged?" It was from 1988, an altercation where Young had allegedly threatened a suspect during an arrest. Graves scanned the document and shook his head. "Official reprimand, followed by nothing. They shoved it under the rug. He should have been investigated." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "He learned from us, Mike. Learned that we were too slow, too scared, or too damn lazy to deal with internal problems the right way." The system had allowed Young to walk away with his reputation intact, free to blend into the background and rebuild his life in secrecy, all while leaving the people of Mason vulnerable to his growing darkness, strengthening the foundation. The case became a rallying cry for reform. The Mason Police Department, once regarded as a pillar of small-town security, became ground zero for change. Public outcry forced the department to look introspectively, asking questions that no one wanted to answer. At a heated town hall meeting held a month after Young's conviction, residents demanded accountability. "We trusted you," one woman shouted from the back of the room, clutching a newspaper with Young's mugshot splashed across the front page. "We were raising our kids while you were letting a murderer roam free. How do we know this won't happen again?" Police Chief Harold Mills stood at the podium, his normally stoic voice trembling under the weight of the moment. "We failed you," he admitted, his eyes scanning the crowd of angry faces. "You have every right to demand answers, and changes." Those changes came swiftly, and they came in ways Mason had never seen before. New standards for transparency and ethics. One of the first reforms implemented was stronger oversight within the department. A civilian review board was established, tasked with investigating complaints against officers and ensuring transparency in how investigations were handled. No more unchecked authority. Every action taken internally would now face external eyes, unclouded by bias or camaraderie. Psychological evaluations for officers, once a formality conducted only during recruitment, were expanded into routine assessments every 5 years. These evaluations didn't just screen for competency, they delved into mental health, emotional stability, and signs of latent aggression. "We're taking a hard look at who we let into this uniform," Chief Mills told a local reporter during a press briefing. "The badge isn't a free pass, it's a responsibility. If you can't meet that responsibility, you've got no business being here." Officers were also required to attend annual ethics training, something that had been absent from the department prior to Young's case. These sessions focused on accountability, the importance of honoring whistleblowers, and rooting out corruption before it could take hold. Technology and forensic investments. The case also highlighted the glaring need for advanced forensic resources. In the months following Young's conviction, Mason secured funding for its first state-of-the-art forensics unit, complete with rapid DNA testing capabilities. "No case should take as long as this one did," Rachel told the mayor as they toured the new lab. "Our inability to act fast almost cost us everything. That's not happening again." Local officials also pushed for updated surveillance systems across Mason, including mandatory registration of security cameras by businesses. If another killer were to stalk their streets, they would leave a digital footprint too large to ignore. A lasting legacy. For Graves and Rachel, the changes were necessary, but they didn't come without a cost. The case remained a shadow over their lives, its lessons etched into their decisions as both law enforcement officers and as people. Sitting outside the police station one quiet evening, Rachel lit a cigarette and stared out at the darkened town. "You think we've done enough, Mike?" she asked, breaking the silence. Graves stood next to her, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "Maybe, maybe not. I think we've made it harder for someone like him to do it again." "But not impossible," she countered. Graves sighed. "No system's perfect. There'll always be cracks somewhere, but we've patched the big ones. That's got to count for something." Rachel nodded slowly, taking another drag before flicking the ash. "It's a start." And it was. The monster had been caught, but more importantly, Mason had learned how to stop the next one before they could begin.